Okay. Let me start. I'm getting some messages that people can hear me, but not hearing back from Jana. So, as Jana said, I'm on the Oregon Resource Association board, and I was also the the Land Use and Natural Resources Committee chair. And I just want to do a quick introduction to this webinar. Bill 841, as you know, the Wine Industry Consensus Land Use Bill. Also adopted by a work group convened by Richard Whitman of the Governor's Office. The next work group had representation from the wine industry, planning directors, some Friends of Oregon, Friends of the Florida Bureau, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and others. Some of the key things that the bill did was to remove some sunsets and to clarify several positions. Let me see if I can try this. So if this is better, or if you can hear me at all.
Yes, that's better from our side, Bill.
So just to wrap up my remarks, Senate Bill 841 removes some sunsets that were outstanding and clarified some of the provisions that were put in place by previous bills. Today we want to review some key provisions with you and answer questions. We've been very fortunate to be able to work with Jan Garman of CFM and Mike Velarde of Davis Right Tremaine. Both those gentlemen who are on the call with us today have done an enormous amount of work representing the wine industry, and they'll be guiding us through the webinar today. So Dan and Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Bill. Again, my name is Dan Jarman. I'm a partner with the lobbying and PR firms at CFM Strategic Communications. CFM has represented the Oregon Wine Growers Association in Salem for nearly 20 years, and I've worked with OWA for a number of years as well. And I've more specifically been involved in the legislation that we've seen on commercial activities and events since the 2010 legislative session. So for today's presentation, we're going to hopefully accomplish the following things: talk a little bit about what led to Senate Bill 841. Mike Velarde will talk about its key provisions. We're going to discuss a little bit about what this means to your winery and your winery operations. There are some next steps as it relates to implementing this legislation. And then finally, as Jana indicated at the end of the webinar, we'll have a time to answer some of the questions that you've submitted either via the chat or to Jana's email address. So Senate Bill 841 has been work in progress for a number of years. As many of you know, back in 1989, the Oregon legislature wrote a law that allowed wineries to be established on EFU land. Prior to that, all of it had to be done specifically through counties without any state recognition that wineries could and should exist from a permitted use standpoint. And that, more or less, had been the law of the land for a number of years until about 5 or 6 years ago or so, there was an issue where we had one county in Oregon telling a winery that they believed that the commercial activities that that winery was engaged in was not permitted. And truth be told, that permitted use winery statute that was written in 1989 was fairly silent as it relates to commercial activities and events. Working with OWA, that winery owner worked with some key members of the legislature, and in 2010 crafted legislation that at the time was Senate Bill 1055. And what 1055 had done was it related to, so it implemented some new language talking about the services that could occur at wineries, including private events, and recognizing that events were part of that permitted use winery statute. Without getting into much detail than that, The legislation also included, for the first time, a 25% income limitation on those activities and events at wineries. As many of you know, that 25% income limitation for a number of years has existed in the statute dealing with farm stands. So was it something that the legislators borrowed from the farm stand law as a way to put a check on those commercial activities and events? The issue, though, because at the time this was dealt with during the short special session that only lasted about 4 weeks, the legislature at the time put a sunset on that bill, hoping to come back and revisit some of the provisions in that piece of legislation, which then led to actions in the 2011 session where prior to the 2011 session, the wine industry, OWA, had many conversations with its members and surveys, and a deliberative process where it crafted legislation. That legislation in 2011, at the end of the day, was not a consensus within the wine industry. There were still wine industry members who were uncomfortable with what was being proposed in 2011. And what happened was legislators themselves went into a room and wrote what ultimately were the provisions that were in House Bill 3280, which included a new definition of marketing events, and for those non-marketing events, allowed for 25 days of these non-market events, also called special events. The piece of legislation 3280 also included the continuation of the 25% income limitation. All of those provisions were set to sunset January 1st, 2014. The other thing I'd say about 3280, it really was silent on food service and kitchen facilities, which is an issue that OWA members have for a long time said needed to be clarified because of the various county rulings as it relates to that issue. So that's how we ultimately got to needing to address this issue one more time in the 2013 session. And so in 2012 and leading up to the session, the Oregon Wine Growers Association conducted 3 surveys with its members about commercial activities and events. The Willamette Valley Wineries Association also surveyed its members. The OWA board and key folks within OWA did listening sessions in all of the wine regions in the summer of 2012, talking about this proposed legislation. OWA's Lunar Committee had careful deliberations over the fall of last year, and the Oregon Wine Growers Association board approved legislation to be submitted. Sort of concurrently with that, the governor's office, knowing that this was a very important issue for the governor, very important issue for agriculture in the state, very important issue for the wine industry, launched into a work group that was headed by the governor's chief natural resources advisor, Richard Whitman. And he was the one that worked with the wine industry, with counties, other stakeholders. It included the Oregon Farm Bureau, included Thousand Friends of Oregon, and others to come up with a consensus work group product that ultimately became the language that was in Senate Bill 841. So when this legislation was taken to the legislature in the 2013 session, it wasn't just considered legislation that was produced by OWA or by the wine industry. It was legislation that was produced in a consensus work group effort sponsored by the governor's office. So, and the legislation that was crafted, Senate Bill 841 and submitted to the legislature was very similar to what was ultimately passed. And now I'll turn it over to Mike Gilardi from Davis Wright Tremaine to talk about the details contained in Senate Bill 841.
Good morning, everyone. As Dan said, I'm Mike Gilardi. I'm OWA's Land Use and Natural Resources Counsel. I practice law with the firm Davis Wright Tremaine, and we've been providing help to OWA and its members on the full spectrum of legal issues for many years. I'm happy to be here with you all this morning. So getting to this slide in front of you shows as the title implies, the key provisions of Senate Bill 841. I'm going to talk about each one of these provisions in some detail, but I want to highlight several things off the bat. The first key point of the legislation is that it clarifies the distinction between marketing activities that are allowed at a winery as of right without limit, and it distinguishes those activities from special events, which are limited in number and subject to some county oversight in the Willamette Valley. Second, the legislation it resolves an issue about food service at permitted use wineries, and this issue kind of arose over the years due to a kind of historic quirk in the permitted use winery statute, and it was an issue that the legislature was not able to resolve in 2011, and it kind of created some confusion and some larger problems for the way that counties were kind of permitting wineries and interpreting the law governing wineries. So we think we were able to get a good resolution to the food issue that kind of set some reasonable rules of the road, and I'll talk about those. Next, the 25% income rule that Dan talked about, it's retained in the new law. It's clarified though, so it's so folks know sort of how that income limitation is calculated. And then the last 2 points on there, primarily this bill applies to wineries that are cited as permitted uses on exclusive farm use land, but there are many wineries that are either located in other types of zones or that are don't qualify as permitted uses for a variety of reasons, and they traditionally have been permitted using other mechanisms, most frequently as a conditional use. They're conditional use permits, or sometimes they're called CUPs. And so this new law, it covers those folks as well, and I'll talk about how it does that. So first, to talk about the marketing provisions, the Senate Bill 841 reaffirmed that wineries are allowed to have tasting room facilities as of right, that sort of comes with the privilege of being able to develop a winery on farmland. That was in the 2011 law for the first time, and then there was some discussion about whether to keep it in 2013, and we were able to persuade the legislature that should stay. So it's clear in the law that wineries are allowed to have tasting rooms to market and sell their wine. Second, it defines what's considered marketing activity, and it does that in two ways. First, it provides a list of the specific kinds of activities that are allowed as of right as wine marketing, and that list was developed by a working group in Yamhill County. And this next slide here, it has the full list of things that are allowed as marketing. That Yamhill group did really good work on that. It really helped to create a good consensus going into the legislative session, and I think it helped create a lot of goodwill in Yamhill County and helped that county kind of establish a leadership role in working with the other counties to try to sort these rules out and implement them going forward. Let me go back to the last slide. So the other way that the legislation defines marketing activities is it contrasts them with so-called special events. Now, the list of things that we just saw that are considered marketing activities, those are just examples. And really the key test is any activity where the primary purpose is to market a winery's wine from an objective perspective, that is considered marketing activity, and that is allowed as of right. Now, by contrast, any activity where the marketing of wine is secondary to some other purpose, that's considered a special event. And the classic example of that is a wedding, right? If the primary purpose of a wedding is not to market wine, but it's to celebrate people getting married. Now, a winery's purpose for having that event may be to market wine, but objectively, that's not the primary purpose of the event. So that's how we distinguish between marketing and special events. And again, this is the list of the activities that are specified as being marketing activities. It covers a lot of ground, but again, we don't want to limit folks to just what's on the list. We want people to have the freedom to come up with creative marketing strategies, and that's why we have sort of the conceptual test about what's the primary purpose of the event. You can see from the second bullet from the bottom, that's basically the language in the law. Similar activities conducted the primary purpose of promoting wine. And then there is an additional provision kind of in the marketing section of the law that covers charitable events. And it says that charitable events are considered marketing and they are allowed as of right as long as you're not charging a facility use fee. So special events, the Yamhill group also came up with the examples of the kinds of events that would fall under this more limited special events category. And you can see that in the first bullet point. It's celebratory gatherings it means weddings, facility rentals, and other kind of educational and cultural events. Those are the examples, and again, it's any kind of event where the marketing of wine is the secondary purpose of the event. So these special events are limited to 18 per year. And then in the Willamette Valley, these events are subject to an additional kind of county oversight process. It's a streamlined permitting process. How this works, and again, this applies in the Willamette Valley. The Willamette Valley includes all of the counties that you would think of as encompassing the physical valley, and that stretches all the way from Multnomah County to in the north to Lane County in the south. The way that the events process works is that if you want to have up to 6 of these special events, you can get kind of an administrative license from the county. It's not considered a land use permit. It's basically it's purely done by the staff of the county, and there is not a public process for folks to weigh in on that, and there's no appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals on that. So that's intended to be a very simple administrative process. If you get above 6 events, if you have 7 to 18, then it is considered a land use permit, but we have tried to make that process as efficient as is possible under Oregon's land use laws. Basically, the way that it works is you will apply and the county staff will issue a decision, and they are allowed to put certain conditions on that permit to basically limit impacts to the neighborhood, restrictions on traffic and event hours and that kind of thing. And then there is a notice that goes out to the local neighborhood after that decision has been made. And anyone, including the winery, will have the right to basically appeal at the local level and request a hearing before a local body to kind of sort out those issues and what the conditions specifically should be to ensure that these events aren't impacting the neighborhood. So that is the basic process for the special events. Next, the food issue. The first point here is that professional kitchen facilities are allowed at permitted use wineries. That was something that was not clear in prior versions of the law, and different counties had different policies on that. For those of you that have kitchens, traditionally they've been inspected by the Oregon Department of Agriculture. The law has been very confusing as to whether the Department of Agriculture or the local county health departments have that inspection authority, and ODA and the counties had sort of a loose agreement on that wasn't real clear and didn't always work that well in practice. And so the new law specifies that the county health departments are going to inspect these kitchens just like they inspect restaurants. And folks in the industry, reported to us that they preferred to see the counties do the inspections rather than ODA because they were sort of more responsive to local needs. So you can have kitchen facilities; they will be overseen by the county health departments. In terms of the food that's allowed to be served through the kitchen or otherwise through a caterer, is basically you're allowed to pair food with wine, but the food service can't be so extensive that you're effectively operating a restaurant. It's intended to be sort of a common sense, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck kind of standard. Ultimately, that's going to be up to the counties on how exactly they want to enforce that. But the idea is to allow folks to have reasonable food service as part of responsible alcohol service and to help visitors to enhance visitors' appreciation of the wine. And then finally, in the 2011 law, there was a kind of a new category of large winery that was developed, and these large wineries, of which there are very few Oregon wineries that can qualify under those standards, but those folks are allowed to have restaurants under certain conditions, and the new law doesn't change that. But it does allow those wineries who could qualify for a full-on restaurant to also have the same basic food privileges as other wineries if they choose not to have a full-on restaurant. Now, the 25% rule, as Dan said, this is an income limit that was first brought in 2010, and the idea is to ensure that wineries are focusing on making wine and selling wine and not on conducting commercial activities as a sort of independent source of income. And so what it does is it limits all the other stuff that you're selling other than wine to 25% of your on-site retail sales of wine. So it's a ratio. The numerator of the ratio is the other stuff that you're selling, and the denominator is the sales that you're making on-site of your wine. What we've done in Senate Bill 841 is to sort of clarify, to sort of unpack that ratio and figure out sort of what goes into it specifically. So the things that go into the numerator, the other stuff, the incidental sales, those are facility rental fees, food sales, and any other kind of items that you're selling, souvenirs, that kind of thing. But third-party income does not count towards the 25% limit. So if you're hosting a wedding at your winery and the couple are paying for a caterer, or they're paying for a photographer, or they're paying for all kinds of other things, all of that money is not calculated towards the 25% limit. It's only the money that's received directly by the winery. Now, in terms of the denominator of that ratio, the on-site retail sales, we've defined that to include not only wine that's physically sold in the tasting room, but wine that's sold through the internet or over the phone or through a wine club. So that simplifies the accounting quite a bit over some of the other proposals that were out there when we were putting this together. The counties have the ability to request, verification that you're in compliance with this limit in the form of a letter by a certified public accountant. And another issue another important issue in kind of the implementation of the new law is grandfathering of existing wineries that were permitted under earlier versions of the law, and who had sort of relied on the prior versions of the law in order to develop their business models. There's a concept in land use law that's called non-conforming use. And what the non-conforming use law says is that if you were legally established for any kind of a use of your land, and then the law changes such that that use is not allowed anymore, you're allowed to continue doing what you were doing as long as it's an ongoing practice. If you stop your non-conforming use, then you're not allowed to restart it, and there are limitations on the extent to which you can expand a use that becomes so-called non-conforming. In 2011, we tried to negotiate a more liberal grandfather clause. Non-conforming use law is unfortunately complicated. And we tried to negotiate a more liberal law that would basically recognize the gray area that's in the law and kind of give wineries the benefit of the doubt if they were operating in good faith and sort of legitimately gray area of the law. And that wasn't accepted. And so this year we used a grandfather clause that is consistent with this non-conforming use doctrine that I just described. So what does that mean? If you're an existing winery and you are permitted under a prior version of the law, it's kind of a case-by-case analysis as to whether you're covered by the grandfathering or not. But if you have a permit that specifically allows you to do events beyond what's allowed under the new law, then you should be able to continue under the terms of your permit. If your permit is silent about these kinds of activities, which most of them are, then it's going to be a question of what your historic practice is and how you can document that to your county if necessary. Ultimately, this is an issue of county enforcement. And so as long as your local county is comfortable with your operations, then you should be able to continue doing what you're doing. But as we'll talk about a little bit later, you know, we are going to continue to work with the counties on the implementation of the new law, and this grandfather issue is going to be one of the big things that we'll be working on to make sure that it's implemented in a reasonable way.
And this is just a reminder that if you do have questions as we get towards that part of the presentation, please send them to us in the chat function or to my email, jana@oregonwine.org.
Now, as I said up front, the new law it covers a broader range of wineries than were covered traditionally by this permitted use winery statute. Not all wineries are on exclusive farm use land. Many of them are on, rural wineries are in kind of mixed farm forest zones. Some counties call them agriculture forestry or AF. Some will call them farm forest or FF. There are sort of a variety of names, but the basic idea is that these are kind of transition zones between the valley floor and foothills where there are more kind of timber-dominated resource use, and so the zoning laws allow a mixture of farming and forestry activities. Well, the new Senate Bill 841 applies the same basic EFU winery rules to this mixed farm forest zone. And generally speaking, before this new law, the counties were using the EFU rules in these mixed farm forest zones, but sometimes there were kind of quirks in the local code or misunderstandings here and there, and there was kind of a potential for problems. And so we've gone ahead. The new law basically subjects all of these wineries in these mixed zones to the same rules that apply in the EFU zone. So that should make things a little more simple and clear for the industry and for the counties who are applying this law. And then the second bullet point on this slide is it's a new narrow provision that will allow wineries to be a permitted use in certain use circumstances. The basic rules are in the EFU zone and now in the mixed farm forest zone that if you have a 15-acre vineyard on site, then you qualify to have a permitted use winery and you can produce up to 50,000 gallons of wine a year. If you have 40 acres on site or on contiguous properties, then you can produce an unlimited amount of wine. Well, the new category allows a little more flexibility for wineries that have substantial acreage, but it's not all contiguous. And so that second bullet point kind of lays that out. You have to have a 15 acres on site on a larger tract of land, group of parcels under common ownership that are at least 40 acres, and then an additional 40 acres of vineyards within 15 miles of the winery. And lastly, as I mentioned, there are many wineries that don't qualify for permitted use status because they don't have the 15 acres on site, or maybe they don't meet the production limitations, or they may have business models in terms of commercial activities that put them outside of the boundaries of what has been traditionally allowed and continues to be allowed under the permitted use rules that we've been talking about. And these wineries traditionally have been cited under as conditional uses. Under the state's exclusive farm use laws, there are basically two lists of uses. The one half are permitted uses, and the other half are conditional uses. And these conditional use wineries are, it's a sort of a case-by-case kind of county permitting process that allows the counties to tailor the permits to meet the winery's needs, but it requires the wineries to show that they're not going to impact farming operations in the local area. And there's a particular process and some particular legal standards around that. That pathway it was established by the courts in 1989, and there has been some recent litigation under that pathway in terms of what wineries are allowed to do. And the courts have developed some general standards about what a winery needs to do to qualify as a conditional use. And so what Senate Bill 841 does is it preserves the standards that the courts have developed, and it affirms that that conditional use pathway is still available despite the changes that we've made to the second pathway, the permitted use pathway. But it does subject these conditional use wineries to the 25% rule. But other than that, the conditional use laws stay the same as they were previously. And then the last point here is that there is a provision in the law that allows bed and breakfasts that are sited on a tract that includes a winery to serve a second meal. And the idea there is just to make sure the folks who are out tasting wine all day have somewhere where they can go and get some food. Okay, so just to sum it all up, we've got unlimited marketing activities allowed as of right. That's distinguished from the special events, which are limited to 18 a year, and they are subject to a licensing process in the Willamette Valley counties. Record keeping is going to be important in terms of documenting compliance with that special event limitation and with the 25% income limitation. And finally, the law is effective immediately. There was basically when the legislature creates a law, they can set a date when it applies, or they can create what's called an emergency clause and have it effective immediately. Senate Bill 841 had an emergency clause, so it is in effect, and it's permanent until the legislature affirmatively changes the law for one reason or another. There are no sunset clauses as there were in the 2010 and the 2011 laws. So the next steps, because the law is effective immediately, we're beginning to work with the counties to implement the law, this special events permitting process, for example, and the grandfathering rules. I think those are going to be the two big issues, with food being the third, in terms of drawing the line or developing enforcement policies around how much, at what point do you cross the line and effectively become a restaurant because of the extent of your service. And then finally, just this was a very successful legislative session. This was a consensus law. It was passed unanimously by both houses of the legislature, which is unheard of in land use law. And so there's a lot of goodwill that's been built by this process, and we want to continue that going forward as we implement the law and work out any kinks that are there. Now we'll take your questions. Sure. Sure. So we got a few questions here that I think I can tick through pretty quickly. The first is about the licensing for the kitchen facilities. And as I said, this is going to be done by the county health departments, just like if you were a restaurant, you would go to your local county health authority and get your restaurant license, and then they're inspected basically once a year. So that's how that works. Another question that came in about food is whether there is a definition of the preparation of food and beverages, and no, there's no definition of preparation, but basically you're allowed to have the kitchen facilities, and so you can make the food on site, or you can also have a caterer who brings in the food and does some portion of the food preparation in the kitchen. So it spans a whole spectrum from having the food fully prepared at the winery to having the food brought in ready to serve. There's another question about the legislative history surrounding menu. How much food service is allowed before you become a restaurant, and there really isn't. I mean, what the text of the law says is that you can serve food, but the food service can't be, but it can involve menu options such that the winery effectively operates as a cafe or a restaurant. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't have any menu options. I mean, maybe you have a vegetarian option and a meat option. But the idea is that you're pairing the food with the wine. You're using the food to complement the wine and to get something in people's stomachs because they're drinking. So it's about responsible alcohol service, and it's about appreciation of the wine. If the primary purpose is there for people to go and have dinner, and then you're closer to the line. But the other thing to remember here is that the 25% rule applies, and so if you're inside of that 25% limit in terms of the income that you're generating from your food service, and you don't look like a restaurant from the outside, then I think you're in good shape. But again, this is a county enforcement issue, so it's going to be up to the counties to decide exactly how they want to enforce this. But we hope to work with them to make sure everything is working in a reasonable manner. And then the last question in the series the first series that I have is whether there's any recommended forms for a written statement from a CPA. And we don't have that yet, but that's certainly one of the items that we're working on internally and with the counties to try to implement them.
And this is Dan Jarman. To that point, as Mike Gilardi indicated, some very good relationships were built between the wine industry and the counties, both the statewide county organization and the individual counties within the Willamette Valley on these issues, as well as the state. I should have mentioned when I talked about the governor's work group, that also included representatives from, in fact, the head of the Department of Land Conservation Development attended all of the meetings, as well as the Department of Agriculture. So the state agencies also have been on board with this policy that's now been put in 841. As we continue to talk with the counties and the other state agencies about implementing the bill, to us what's very important is hopefully to have licenses, new licenses that are going to be required of this bill, and new permits look similar or the same in all of the counties. It's not going to be helpful to anyone if a county that Washington, or a license that Washington County uses looks a lot different than one that's used in Yamhill County. So our goal is to work with counties to try to come up with a uniform license and permit that can be used in all of these counties, as well as work with them too on some of these other issues, like if indeed someone wants to ask for a letter from a CPA, how can we make that a standardized form? And so that's one of the things when we talk about next steps that OWA will be working closely with the counties and other state agencies so we can have some uniformity to this.
This is Jana again with OWA. We have a lot of questions that came in from the chat functions. The one we answered before were from emails we received in advance. So we will get to your questions eventually. Yes.
Okay, so we're going to move into the chat questions now. The first one that I see asks about if you're already operating a cafe on the property, then what kind of permitting options do you have? I guess the first question there is, can you qualify to be, are you a permitted use winery generally? If so, consider whether the new food privileges kind of meet, what you're already doing. If so, then you're in good shape. The thing about the land use laws in the exclusive farm use zone, I talked about non-conforming use law, where the law gets more restrictive than you're allowed to be grandfathered and to continue doing what you were doing. The other side of that is if you're a permitted use and the law gets more liberal, then you're allowed to take advantage of that. And that's the case in some aspects of the new law. So some folks may have permits that are very restrictive in terms of food service or in terms of other commercial activities, and you may find that you're allowed to do more now under the new law than you are under your permit. The new law will trump your permit. So you kind of get a benefit on both sides there. You get to avoid restrictions or regulations that are more restrictive if you were previously permitted, and you get to basically take advantage of new law instead of your permit if the new law is more liberal, if you're a permitted use winery. But back to this specific cafe question, if you find that your operation goes beyond what's allowed under the permitted use rules in Senate Bill 841, you may have the opportunity to gain a conditional use permit for that operation. The counties have a lot more discretion in terms of what to allow under a conditional use permit, although there is some better guidelines that have been developed through the recent court decisions. So in general, see if you can fit into the permitted use box. If you can't, you may be able to go conditional use. And I guess the final point there is that you can't be grandfathered unless you were operating legally before the new law went into effect. Your operation has to be legally established in order to take advantage of non-conforming use laws. So the new law is not intended to sort of make legal things that were never legal in the first place. The next question is, a particular winery says they were conducting special events since 2004, and they're asking whether they are grandfathered in. First question there is whether your permit specifically allows you to do those events. If so, you're in really good shape, and you should be able to continue to do events consistent with what your permit said. Now, if your permit is silent, which may be the case, many of these permits are silent, then you will want to, document the events that you've been doing since 2004. And you can either affirmatively go to your county and talk to them about this and get their blessing to continue to do the events, or you can just keep doing the events and see whether the county raises an issue with that. I mean, this issue of grandfathering ultimately is an issue of county enforcement. And so the counties will have to take an affirmative action to tell you that you're not in compliance or that you need to go through a non-conforming use process in order to verify that you're allowed. So it is a very case-by-case kind of situation. It's going to be different in different counties, but as I said, it's one of the issues that we are working with counties on to try to find kind of a reasonable implementation of the law. Okay. Now we have a follow-up from one of the earlier questions. And the question says, we are limited to 18 per year, as well as a land use permit to have more than 6 events per year. Well, if you're allowed to be grandfathered, then you will not need a permit from the county to conduct those events. And you will be able to continue to do however many you were doing as of 2004, as long as you can show that those events were legally established at the time that you started to do them. Someone from Lane County is asking about the difference between setting a winery on F2 land versus EFU. Now, this is a question that is specific to the Lane County Code. The EFU zone is a common zone that you'll see across the state. F2 is a Lane County zone. I believe it's a forestry zone, which, I really couldn't answer that question without looking at the specifics of the Lane County Code. That F2 zone may be a mixed farm forest zone that I talked about, or it may be a straight forestry zone. And wineries are actually not allowed in straight forestry zone, but there are some exceptions, and I think in Lane County in particular, due to just the very quirky history in that county. So that's a specific question that we could talk about offline. Thank you. There's another question asking whether all wineries in the Willamette Valley will need to gain these licenses to do special events. And again, that's the grandfathering question. If you've got a history of doing these events, and you can show that and that you've been legally conducting these events, then you won't need a license to do them. You will be grandfathered, but if you want to go beyond what you were doing historically, then you would need a license. And so it's going to be a case-by-case thing. In some cases, wineries might find that it's easier to just go ahead and get the license. And in other cases, the grandfathering may be more efficient.
And this is Dan Jarman. I'll direct this back to Mike. It's true, though, that if a winery in the Willamette Valley has a conditional use permit from a county that allows you to do more than 18, that would be the other exception.
Yeah, and that will be, so there's 2 exceptions. There's the grandfathering that we discussed, and that would apply if you're a permitted use winery and you were permitted under a prior version of the statute. And then the second would be if you're a conditional use winery. If you have a conditional use permit, you're governed by that conditional use permit. None of this Senate Bill 841 applies, except possibly the 25%.
There's a question that came in from one of the members about why is it the Willamette Valley winery are required to have these licensing permits for special events versus non-Willamette Valley wineries. And this more or less was a political issue that we had to deal with as OWA started talking to wineries in the various wine regions about what a policy would look like governing marketing events and these special events. It was very clear from leaders of the Willamette Valley Wineries Association through conversations they had with their members, through surveys they conducted, that they believed it was important for, because of the densities that exist in the wine region or greater in the Willamette Valley, that they have some sort of checks on some of these special events. So it was these wineries in the Willamette Valley, through their association, that asked for this license and permit process. By the same token, as we talk to wineries outside of the Willamette Valley in the other wine regions, they believe that the densities and potential conflicts don't exist in those areas today, and therefore it wasn't necessary to have this licensing and permitting process outside of the Willamette Valley. And policymakers, both in the governor's work group, agreed with that viewpoint, and the legislators did as well. But, you know, truth be told, this is something that all policymakers will keep an eye on over time as we see how the licensing permitting these special events go. You know, there's an opportunity in the future. The legislature meets every year to either scale back a piece of legislation or place greater restrictions on a piece of legislation. But at least at this time, it was the leaders of the Willamette Valley Winery Association who were very adamant that there's some controls, sideboards needed to be put in place around these special events at wineries in the Willamette Valley, given the current densities and the potential for more conflict if more of these wineries did events. And so that's sort of the history and background of that issue. If you haven't heard the story, that's the story, and we'll continue to work on this and keep an eye on it. There's going to be lots of entities in the state that are looking at the cumulative effect, I'll say, of more agritourism, more activities out of wineries, both on the marketing and special events side. So even though this bill is in place with no sunset clauses, winery activities and land use are always of interest to many individuals and legislators and organizations, and I'm sure those will continue.
There's another piece of that question that asks about OLCC and OLCC's food service requirements. Now, and the question refers specifically to a potential OLCC requirement that you supply 2 substantial food items, and then doesn't that necessitate some sort of menu? Well, the food rules in Senate Bill 841 allow wineries to serve food in order to meet OLCC requirements. And in addition to that, you're allowed to do, food service up short of the point of being a restaurant. So the OLCC generally has not applied, the specific 2 substantial food items rule to wineries, although there are individual inspectors within the OLC around the state that have a little bit of a different view on that. I know we've seen this in Southern Oregon, for example. And so if the OLCC comes to you and says you need to have 2 substantial food items, then you're allowed to do that under this new rule. Whatever the OLCC is going to require you to do, you're going to be able to do. But I just also wanted to clarify that the OLCC within that agency doesn't always have a uniform policy on how much food is required at wineries. Okay, someone is asking, there's a member that's saying that they have a CUP because they didn't meet the 15-acre vineyard requirement to be a permitted use, but they were denied the ability to have a tasting room. Now, unfortunately, and the question is, does the county now have to change its policy about having a tasting room because of this new law? And unfortunately, the answer is no, because if you have the 15 acres and you were able to qualify as a permitted use, then they would have to allow you to have a tasting room. But since you don't qualify as a permitted use and you have to go the conditional use route, then the county has the authority to put conditions on your permit, including the condition to not have a tasting room. And that's a pretty extreme permit in terms of its restrictions, but unfortunately, under the law as it exists, the county does have that authority in your case. So your only recourse would be sort of with the political powers that be in your county to get the county to change its policy. And we've got another question about addressing tasting rooms on vineyards with less than 15 acres. And I think it's similar to the prior question. The answer is that if you don't meet the 15-acre requirement and therefore you're not able to be a permitted use, then you are going to need a conditional use permit, or potentially there are other permitting routes available. But the rules are going to be different for you, and the counties are going to have more authority to restrict tasting rooms at those wineries that don't qualify as permitted uses because they don't meet the acreage requirement. We've got another question about the 25% income rule. And the question is whether the 25% is of wine revenue and not of total revenue. And that's correct that it is wine revenue. The ratio is you're allowed to have, the ratio is between your incidental sales on the top half and your on-site retail wine sales on the bottom half. And your on-site retail wine sales include not only physical sales in the tasting room, but also sales through your wine club or on the phone or on the internet. So but it is your gross revenue. It is your gross revenue from your wine sales. That's going to be the key figure there.
So that's the end of the questions that we've received either by email or via chat. If anyone has additional questions, please feel free to type them in now. We'll just wait a minute or two, and then if not, we'll proceed. All right, so it doesn't sound like there are more burning questions that you have. Hopefully got yours answered today. Wanted to apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning when Bill was speaking, but hopefully you were able to hear the rest of the webinar well. We've recorded it, and if that recording went well, we will be posting it online. We can also make the presentation available for you for future reference. So thank you very much to our presenters today, Bill Sweat, Dan Jarman, and Michael Gilardi, and thank you all for participating.